My name is Major Eliza Whitaker, and while my family thinks I spend my days stamping carbon copy forms in a windowless basement at the Department of Motor Vehicles, I am actually the Deputy Director of Tactical Logistics for U.S. Army North, and today I am the only person standing between the President of the United States and a catastrophic impact in a Nebraska cornfield. My sister Sandra, who currently earns a comfortable six-figure salary selling luxury real estate in Scottsdale, Arizona, took a long, theatrical sip of her $14 glass of Santa Margherita Pinot Grigio and adjusted her oversized Prada sunglasses before leaning in to deliver another practiced insult. We were standing in our parents' humid backyard in Ashford, Nebraska, surrounded by the smell of charcoal smoke and cheap bug spray during a family reunion that I had desperately tried to avoid. Sandra looked at my scuffed black Belleville 310 hot weather combat boots with a mixture of pity and disgust, her own feet tucked into gold-trimmed Hermes Oran sandals that cost more than my monthly housing allowance. "You are over 30, Eliza, and you are still playing dress-up in those hideous green fatigues while I am flipping $400,000 condos and actually contributing to the economy," she sneered, her voice carrying across the lawn to where our cousins were playing cornhole. She had no idea that the ruggedized Panasonic Toughbook CF33 vibrating against my thigh wasn't a toy or a prop for a low-level clerk, but a mobile command terminal encrypted with sweet-B cryptographic algorithms. At exactly 2:07 p.m., the haptic feedback on my wrist-mounted Garmin Fenix 7 Pro signaled a Priority 1 override, and when I glanced down, the screen didn't show a mundane notification but a flickering crimson banner that mirrored the cold sweat suddenly blooming on the back of my neck. The text on the screen was a flash override code that I had prayed I would never see in my career. F1 rerouted. Emergency ground command authorized. I felt the atmosphere shift, the heavy afternoon air suddenly tasting like ozone and impending disaster as I realized that Air Force One, a modified Boeing 747-200B known officially as the VC-25A, was suffering a catastrophic dual-engine flameout and was currently falling out of the sky directly over our heads. Sandra continued her monologue about the virtues of a private pension versus a government one, her mouth moving in a blur of glossed pink lipstick, but her voice became white noise as I flipped open the tablet and authorized the ground command protocols. Within a 50-mile radius of this specific coordinate in Ashford, I was the highest-ranking officer with the necessary security clearances to establish an emergency landing zone and coordinate with the nearby Offutt Air Force Base. I didn't blink or respond to her comment about me being a pathetic paper pusher because my focus was entirely on the telemetry data streaming across the screen, showing the massive aircraft losing altitude at a rate of 4,000 feet per minute. The contrast was staggering. My sister was worried about her Instagram engagement metrics and the perceived status of her real estate portfolio while I was calculating the load-bearing capacity of the old Highway 20 stretch just 3 miles north of our childhood home. Every second mattered as I bypassed the local civilian air traffic control at Omaha-Epley Airfield and accessed the direct military satellite uplink to signal the Secret Service detail on board. Sandra reached out to flick a piece of lint off my shoulder, her manicured nail clicking against my rank insignia, entirely unaware that the man she considered the leader of the free world was currently bracing for impact while I, the sister she pitted for her lack of ambition, was the only human being on Earth with the coordinates and authority to bring him down safely. This wasn't about the pension or the combat boots anymore. It was about the heavy, silent weight of a duty she could never comprehend, and as the roar of failing jet turbines began to rumble like distant thunder in the west, I knew the time for silence was over. The contrast between my reality and theirs was a physical weight, pressing against my chest like a ballistic plate as the humidity of the Nebraska afternoon clung to my skin. My cousin Jeremy, wearing a counterfeit polo Ralph Lauren shirt that looked tight across his chest, was currently mid-monologue about his latest passive income streams and a $2,300 a month Airbnb flip he had recently secured in a suburb of Lincoln. He leaned back against a chipping cedar picnic table that my father had bought for $40 at a garage sale 3 summers ago, gesturing with a greasy rib as if he were a titan of industry. To everyone at this table, I was nothing more than the quiet failure of the Whitaker clan, a woman who had peaked in high school and then disappeared into the bureaucratic machinery of the government. My mother let out a short, thin sigh that carried more disappointment than any lecture ever could, turning to Aunt Martha and murmuring that at least I had benefits and a stable dental plan. It was as if she were describing a local mail carrier or a filing clerk instead of a woman who had successfully coordinated $12 million in critical equipment transfers while taking active mortar fire in the dust-choked outskirts of Kandahar. They saw a 30-something spinster who had arrived in a dusty 2018 Toyota Corolla and contributed nothing but store-bought generic soda to the family potluck. But the Pentagon saw the primary logistics coordinator for the President of the United States. I felt the vibration of my field tablet again, a sharp and rhythmic pulse against my thigh that signaled the escalating emergency. While Jeremy bragged about his credit score and the Egyptian cotton sheets he bought for his rental property, I was staring at the encrypted data feed of a $400 million aircraft that was currently turning into a multi-ton glider. The sheer ignorance of my family felt suffocating. They were worried about the price of gas at the local Casey's General Store while I was calculating the fuel burn rate of a crashing VC-25A. I shifted my weight in my $160 Garmont T8 Bifida tactical boots, feeling the familiar grip of the tread against the dry grass, a stark contrast to the flimsy fashion sneakers the men around me were wearing. My sister Sandra laughed at something Jeremy said, her eyes flitting to me with a look of predatory pity, likely preparing another comment about how I should have gone into nursing or interior design. She had no concept of the fact that the encrypted field tablet in my hand was currently communicating with the National Military Command Center at the Pentagon. I stood there, the invisible officer, watching my mother meticulously arrange paper plates and plastic forks while I was mentally mapping out the extraction route for the most powerful man on Earth. The arrogance of their assumptions was almost comical. They viewed my silence as a lack of ambition rather than the disciplined restraint of a woman who held national security secrets in her head like a loaded weapon. I looked at the weathered grain of the picnic table and then back at the flickering screen of my tablet, where the altitude readout was dropping into the red zone. The president was 6 minutes away from a catastrophic arrival in a county that didn't even have a functioning trauma center, and the only person who could save him was the woman they were currently pitying for her lack of a husband and a high-rise office. I took a slow breath, the scent of charcoal and cheap beer fading as my combat training took over, narrowing my world down to the data points and the life-or-death stakes that my family would never be able to comprehend. If they knew that the sky above their heads was about to tear open with the roar of a dying giant, their petty concerns about Airbnb ratings would vanish in an instant. But for now, I remained the Whitaker failure, the silent major waiting for the moment to strike. The betrayal reached its nauseating peak when Sandra lunged for my wrist with her manicured hand, her gold Cartier Love bracelet clinking against the rugged bezel of my watch as she tried to pull me into the frame of her iPhone 15 Pro Max for a sisterly selfie intended for her 12,400 followers. "Smile for the camera, Liz," she chirped with a predatory glint in her eyes. "Let all these people see the true face of government stagnation and what happens when you settle for a desk job in a windowless office." The entire table erupted in a chorus of cruel, mocking laughter that felt like a physical assault, the sharp sound of cheap plastic forks hitting soggy paper plates punctuating my public humiliation while my father refused to look up from his cob of grilled corn and my brother reached across the table to high-five Jeremy. I felt the heat rising in my neck, not from embarrassment, but from the sheer, staggering irony of the situation as I stepped back into the lengthening shadows of the wraparound porch where the cloying scent of burnt peach cobbler and smoldering charcoal stung my nostrils like an omen of the fire to come. They saw a woman retreating in shame, a sister who couldn't handle a little family ribbing, but in reality I was moving toward the perimeter to establish a secure comms line because my encrypted device had just delivered the final, chilling confirmation that changed everything. "Command confirmed, Major," the glowing text read against the black background of the military-grade interface, followed by the words that shifted the weight of the entire world onto my shoulders. "You are the perimeter." While Sandra was busy tagging her location and applying a filter to make the Nebraska sky look more vibrant for her digital audience, I was looking at a top-down satellite thermal feed showing the president's aircraft trailing a massive heat signature of failing titanium and burning jet fuel. The sky above our quiet, judgmental family reunion was about to become a theater of national crisis, and as I gripped the railing of the porch, I could feel the vibration of the heavy engines in my very marrow, a low-frequency hum that the others mistook for distant summer thunder. My sister's voice continued to drift over to me, mocking my lack of a social life and my choice of footwear, completely oblivious to the fact that within minutes, Black Hawk helicopters would be screaming over our chimney and the quiet street would be swarming with Secret Service agents looking for the officer in charge. I looked at my mother, who was meticulously scraping a bit of stray potato salad off the plastic tablecloth, and felt a sudden sharp pang of distance so vast it felt like I was already standing on another planet. They had spent years building a narrative of my failure to make themselves feel more successful, constructing a hierarchy based on property values and superficial prestige, never imagining that the quiet girl they pitted was the only thing standing between the continuity of government and total chaos. I checked the sidearm concealed beneath my untucked polo shirt, the cold steel of the Sig Sauer M18 a grounding reality against my hip, and watched as the first faint streak of smoke appeared on the western horizon, cutting through the haze of the afternoon sun. The time for being the Whittaker failure was over. The major had taken command, and as the ground began to tremble with the approach of the falling giant, I knew that their world of petty insults and passive-aggressive pities was about to be incinerated by the cold, hard reality of the life I had actually chosen to lead. Family isn't always the people who share your blood. Sometimes, family is just the people who happen to be standing around when the truth finally comes crashing down from the clouds at 500 miles per hour. I climbed into the cab of my 2019 Chevrolet Silverado 1500 RE. The heavy door thudding shut with a pressurized seal that instantly drowned out the distant, shrill laughter of Sandra and the clinking of cheap beer bottles against the picnic table. I sat in the driver's seat for exactly 60 seconds, the digital clock on the Chevrolet Infotainment 3 system ticking from 2:14 p.m. to 2:15 p.m. while the smell of conditioned leather and stale coffee grounds grounded my racing heart. With a steady hand, I reached into the glove box and bypassed the stack of mundane registration papers to pull out a thick manila folder labeled with a red top secret stamp, which contained not family photos or sentimental mementos, but the hard copy contingency landing zone protocols for Lincoln Regional Airport and the surrounding municipal strips. I looked back through the tinted glass at the glowing windows of my parents' house, a small, unremarkable structure in a world that didn't know the real me and likely never would. It was in that moment of profound isolation that I realized love is a luxury I had traded away long ago, but duty is a debt that must be paid in full regardless of the personal cost. I did not need the validation of a sister who measured her worth in Scottsdale real estate commissions or a mother who pitied my lack of a wedding ring because I needed 40 minutes of absolute, uninterrupted silence to prevent a national catastrophe of historic proportions. My reflection in the rearview mirror was a stranger's face, cold and analytical, as I reached up to pull my chestnut hair into a bun so tight it felt like a ballistic helmet against my skull, a physical transformation that signaled the end of my civilian masquerade. Eliza, the daughter, the quiet failure who brought store-bought soda to reunions, was effectively dead in that cabin, and Major Whittaker was officially on duty. I gripped the steering wheel, the texture of the leather beneath my palms providing a tactile anchor as I opened the encrypted Panasonic tablet and watched the telemetry for Air Force One drop another 2,000 feet on the digital topographical map. The aircraft was a flaming spear aimed at the heart of the Midwest, and while my family argued about the best way to flip a two-bedroom condo, I was coordinating the redirection of every available emergency response unit within 3 counties. I felt no resentment now. Only a chilling professional clarity that stripped away the hurt of their insults and replaced it with the heavy iron of my rank. My thumb hovered over the ignition button of the Silverado, the engine purring to life with a low-frequency growl that seemed to vibrate in sync with the approaching disaster in the western sky. I glanced one last time at the backyard where Jeremy was likely still bragging about his passive income, and I felt a flicker of grim satisfaction knowing that the world they occupied was a fragile bubble I was currently working to keep from bursting. They lived in the light of a sun they took for granted, while I operated in the shadows of the machinery that kept it burning, a sentinel they would never acknowledge or thank. I shifted the truck into drive, the gravel crunching beneath my Goodyear Wrangler tires as I began to roll toward the edge of the property, leaving the Whittaker family drama behind for the stark, unforgiving reality of a high-stakes recovery operation. There would be no more apologies for my scuffed boots or my quiet life because the woman who was about to save the presidency didn't have time for the petty grievances of people who thought a credit score was the ultimate measure of a human being. I was the perimeter, I was the coordinator, and as the first low-altitude siren began to wail from the volunteer fire station 3 miles away, I knew that the debt of my duty was about to be collected in the most public way imaginable. I did not reach for a lawyer or a public relations specialist to mitigate the fallout of my sudden departure from the dinner table because I was already dialing the direct emergency patch for the Nebraska State Patrol and the 155th Air Refueling Wing at Lincoln Air National Guard Base. I stood firmly on the dead patches of the buffalo grass lawn, my posture shifting into the rigid, unmistakable silhouette of a field-grade officer as I began barking precise GPS coordinates into a secure satellite line that bypassed every civilian cellular tower in the county. Lock down Route 14 from the intersection of Highway 6 to the gravel turnoff at mile marker 82 and establish a 3-mile restricted kinetic airspace immediately, I commanded, my voice dropping into the low, resonant frequency of a woman who is used to being obeyed by men twice her size. Through the double-paned glass of the kitchen window, I could see Sandra holding her phone up to capture my intense phone call, her lips curling into a smirk as she undoubtedly narrated a comedic update to her followers about her sister's delusional self-importance. She was busy framing a story about how I was likely arguing with a collections agency or a low-level supervisor at the DMV, entirely unaware that the sequence of numbers I had just recited was authorizing the mobilization of federal assets and the suspension of civil liberties within a 10-mile radius. The sheer, blissful ignorance of her life was a luxury I was currently dismantling with every syllable, yet she continued to laugh, probably telling Jeremy that I was having a nervous breakdown right next to the hydrangeas. Little did she know that 3 armored black Chevrolet Suburbans with darkened District of Columbia plates and $85,000 worth of integrated Harris Falcon 3 encrypted communication gear were already screaming down Interstate 80 at 95 miles per hour. Their high-intensity LED strobes cutting through the afternoon haze as they converged on our quiet gravel driveway. The air began to taste of metallic static as the military-grade jamming signals from my tablet started to interfere with the local Wi-Fi, causing Sandra's live stream to buffer and freeze, a minor inconvenience that was the first herald of the total operational takeover I was initiating. I ignored the confused shouting from the porch as my brother complained about his phone losing signal because my eyes were fixed on the western horizon, where a thin, jagged line of black smoke was now clearly visible against the pale blue of the Nebraska sky. The president's plane was no longer a theoretical data point on a screen but a physical mass of screaming metal and failing hydraulics that was precisely 4 minutes from making a forced landing on the very asphalt where my family went for Sunday drives. I checked the tension on my Sig Sauer M18 holster and adjusted the collar of my polo, feeling the cool weight of the encrypted comms earpiece I had just slotted into my left ear. The transition was complete, and as the distant rhythmic thumping of twin-engine Hueys began to vibrate in the soles of my boots, the Whitaker family reunion was effectively over. I stood as a sentinel on the edge of their small, petty world, the primary coordinator for a national survival event, watching as the first black SUV crested the hill at the end of the road with its sirens silent but its presence deafening. Sandra's phone finally slipped from her hand as the reality of the black-clad men jumping out of the vehicles began to register, her Scottsdale dreams evaporating in the face of a military-grade reality she couldn't begin to process. I didn't look back at her. I didn't need to see the shock on her face to know that the sister she had spent a decade belittling was currently the most important person in the state of Nebraska. The perimeter was being established, the sky was falling, and I was the only one with the clearance to catch it. The party was in full swing when the first subterranean vibration hit the soles of my feet, sending a rhythmic tremor through the packed earth that caused a ceramic tray of paprika-dusted deviled eggs to slide slowly off the edge of the picnic table and shatter on the grass. The low-frequency hum of a twin-engine Sikorsky U-60 Black Hawk began to rattle the window panes of our childhood home with such intensity that the silverware began to dance against the stoneware plates, and 45 of my relatives froze in a state of suspended animation, their mouths half open in mid-sentence. I walked deliberately into the center of the yard, my posture shifting into a steel rod as the casual slouch of a family failure evaporated to reveal the rigid discipline of a major in the United States Army. I wasn't holding a lukewarm beer or a paper plate piled with potato salad anymore. I was holding a ruggedized Getac F110 tablet with a sunlight-readable display that was currently showing a live, high-definition infrared feed of our entire neighborhood and the surrounding 5-mile tactical zone. The sky above our property turned a bruised, metallic dark as the first blacked-out chopper banked hard over the towering 100-year-old oak trees at the edge of the lot, the violent downward force of the rotor wash kicking up a mini-cyclone of dry leaves and lawn debris. I watched with a cold, detached sense of justice as the gale-force wind caught Sandra's $200 Ferragamo silk scarf, ripping it from her neck and sending it fluttering through the air like a dying bird before it landed squarely in the middle of a massive bowl of warm queso dip. She didn't even scream. She couldn't because the sheer acoustic power of the military aircraft had pressurized the air around us, making it difficult to breathe or think. My brother dropped his burger into the dirt, his eyes wide with a terror I had seen many times in combat zones but never in a Nebraska backyard, as he realized that the sister he had mocked for having a desk job was currently the eye of the storm. The grass was flattened into a concentric pattern of green waves as the Black Hawk hovered just 30 feet above the power lines, its nose-mounted FLIR sensor turret swiveling with predatory precision to lock onto my position. My tablet flashed a green authentication code, confirming that the encrypted transponder in my hand had successfully linked with the lead pilot's heads-up display. I ignored the chaos behind me, the panicked questions from my aunts, the confused shouting of my cousins and my father's stunned silence, because my world had narrowed down to the tactical execution of a survival landing. The heat signature on my screen showed Air Force One was now less than 90 seconds from the emergency touchdown point, its massive silhouette casting a shadow that swallowed the entire block. I raised my hand in a sharp, authoritative signal to the pilot above, ignoring the sting of the dust in my eyes as the second and third helicopters appeared on the horizon, their sirens finally cutting through the roar with a terrifying high-pitched wail. This was no longer a family reunion. It was a high-stakes extraction site, and I was the undisputed sovereign of this square of Nebraska soil. The Whitaker family had spent 20 years underestimating me, but as the ground began to buck under the weight of the approaching disaster, they were finally seeing the woman the Pentagon trusted with the life of the commander-in-chief. The air smelled of burnt J-8 fuel and ozone, a sharp contrast to the domestic sense of grilled corn and cheap beer, and I felt a grim, professional satisfaction knowing that the facade of my ordinary life had been stripped away by the sheer force of necessity. I was the perimeter, I was the command, and the relative who had just been pitted for her lack of ambition was now the only thing keeping the world from falling apart on their front lawn. Every micro-movement of my fingers on the GETAC screen adjusted the landing light parameters for the incoming motorcade, and as the first tactical team fast-roped onto the adjacent street, the reality of my secret life was finally laid bare for all 45 of them to witness in absolute trembling silence. Everyone indoors. Now, I commanded, my voice stripping away years of family subservience and replacing it with the jagged edge of a weapon forged in the high-pressure environments of tactical operations. The sound of my command sliced through the thick, humid air of the backyard, vibrating with a frequency that silenced the rattling window panes and the distant clatter of falling silverware. My cousin Jeremy, still clinging to the pathetic remains of his arrogance, let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh that sounded brittle against the backdrop of the hovering Black Hawk, looking around at the stunned faces of our relatives and asking who I thought I was, G.I. Jane. I did not waste a single breath on an argument or a witty retort because the time for civilian pleasantries had expired when the first landing gear door was forced open in the sky above us. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled my silver oak leaf major insignia and my common access card, slamming them onto the sun-bleached wood of the picnic table directly next to a bowl of melting potato salad with a force that made the plastic spoons jump. Major Eliza Whitaker, I stated, my eyes locking onto Jeremy's with a predatory stillness that caused his smirk to vanish instantly as he realized the woman standing before him was a stranger he had never actually known. This property is now a restricted federal zone under the authority of the Department of Defense and the United States Secret Service, and if you do not move your bodies into that house in exactly 10 seconds, the tactical agents currently fast-roping onto the north fence line will be authorized to treat you as a hostile threat to the mission. The laughter did not just stop. It died a violent and immediate death, leaving a vacuum of sound that was somehow heavier and more oppressive than the deafening roar of the helicopter engines overhead. Sandra stood frozen, her mouth agape as she looked from my identification card to the black-clad figures now dropping with professional fluidity over our backyard fence, their suppressed rifles held in a low-ready position. I could see the gears turning in my father's head as he finally registered the weight of the silver oak leaf, a symbol of authority that carried more power in this moment than all of Jeremy's passive income streams combined. My mother began to tremble, her hand going to her throat as she looked at the daughter she had pitted for her lack of benefits, only to find a cold-eyed officer who was currently orchestrating a national defense protocol on her lawn. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the mechanical heat radiating from the Getak tablet in my hand, which was now chirping with the final approach vector for the president's emergency transport. I counted down the seconds in my head, watching as my relatives finally broke their trance and scrambled toward the sliding glass door in a state of pure, unadulterated panic that stripped away every ounce of their Scottsdale-bred pretension. Sandra tripped over her own Hermes sandals in her haste to escape the rotor wash, her silk scarf now a sodden orange-stained rag in the queso dip, but I didn't reach out to help her. My focus was entirely on the perimeter, watching as the first Secret Service counter-assault team moved past the swing set and the rusted barbecue grill to secure the driveway. The silence that followed their frantic retreat into the house was profound, a tactical stillness that indicated the area was now sterilized and ready for the arrival of the most important man on Earth. I was no longer a sister, a daughter, or a disappointment. I was the primary ground coordinator for a Level 1 national emergency, and as the first armored suburban tires crunched onto the gravel of our road, I knew that the Whitaker family would never look at a paper pusher the same way again. I stood alone in the center of the flattened grass, a sentinel in scuffed boots, waiting for the sky to yield its burden while the people who had mocked me watched through the windows in terrified, reverent silence. Family is often the last to see the truth, but when the truth arrives with the force of a falling star and the authority of the Pentagon, it leaves no room for anything but the realization of one's own insignificance. The public execution of their massive collective ego continued as I moved with a cold and tactical precision to rope off the perimeter of the backyard using high-visibility nylon cord, completely ignoring Sandra's hysterical and high-pitched cries that I was intentionally ruining the family reunion for my own self-importance. I did not offer a single word of comfort as I stepped toward a Secret Service agent who had just emerged from the lead black Chevrolet Suburban, his Breitling emergency mission watch glinting sharply in the harsh Nebraska sun as he adjusted the acoustic tube in his ear. He didn't look at Jeremy or my father for permission to be on the property. Instead, he snapped a crisp and professional salute that carried the terrifying weight of federal authority directly toward me. "Orders, Major," he asked in a voice that was devoid of emotion, his eyes scanning the horizon for the approaching aircraft while his hand remained hovering near the grip of his sidearm. I didn't even grant my family the dignity of a backward glance as I replied that I wanted him to clear the remaining civilians and establish a total visual lockdown on the house, ensuring that no one could document or interfere with the sensitive extraction about to take place on our lawn. The sound of my command triggered an immediate and coordinated response as 6 more agents in tactical vests began ushering my stunned relatives behind the heavy oak doors of the farmhouse, their expensive Scottsdale casual wear fluttering in the violent downdraft of the circling helicopters. I watched through the screen of my Getak tablet as the thermal signatures of my cousins and aunts moved into the living room, their silhouettes appearing small and frightened on the digital display compared to the massive heat bloom of the dying jet engines. Sandra was the last to be moved, her face a mask of tear-streaked foundation and disbelief as she finally realized that the sister she had called a pathetic paper pusher was the commanding officer of the entire local theater of operations. The reality of the situation was finally settling over the Whitaker household like a heavy shroud of industrial smoke, replacing the scent of grilled meat with the sharp and metallic tang of high-stakes military intervention. I stood in the center of the now-vacant yard, the wind from the approaching Boeing VC-25A beginning to whip the grass into a frenzy and drowning out the last remnants of human chatter. This was the moment where my 2 lives collided and only one survived the impact, leaving the daughter they thought they knew buried under the steel trap focus of Major Whitaker. I adjusted my own headset, feeling the satisfying click of the encryption key engaging as I informed the pilot that the landing zone was now hot and secured. The silence from the house was absolute, a reverent and terrified quiet that indicated my family was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of the debt I paid every day to keep their worlds spinning. I was no longer an ignored guest at a summer barbecue but the singular point of contact for a global crisis, and as the massive shadow of the president's plane began to swallow the backyard, I knew that the era of being underestimated by the Whitakers had come to a violent and permanent end. My world was one of coordinates, contingencies, and cold steel, and as the first tire made contact with the makeshift runway of the rural highway nearby, I felt a grim sense of fulfillment that no amount of passive income or luxury real estate could ever provide. They were safe because I was dangerous, and as the perimeter held firm, I prepared to greet the man who relied on my logistics to stay alive. The climax arrived with the deafening, earth-shaking roar of twin General Electric CF6-80C2B1 engines, a sound so primal and massive that it seemed to vibrate the very marrow in my bones as Air Force One, the iconic blue and white VC-25, breached the low-hanging cloud layer directly above our small town of Ashford. I stood my ground in the center of the yard, the wind from the approaching giant nearly knocking the breath from my lungs, while my family huddled like frightened children behind the lace curtains of the living room, their faces pale as they watched their supposed loser sister direct a precision motorcade of 12 armored vehicles and a highly specialized tactical recon team. The sheer scale of the operation was a physical blow to their reality. The humble backyard was now a high-stakes theater of national security, illuminated by the flashing strobes of the Suburbans and the rhythmic pulse of the overhead helicopters. Sandra, driven by a desperate pathological need for attention even in the face of a national emergency, tried to slip through the back door to go live on TikTok with her trembling iPhone 15, hoping to monetize the chaos for her followers. I didn't even turn my head to look at her as I reached back with a blind, practiced efficiency and snatched the titanium-framed phone from her hand before she could hit the record button, handing the device immediately to a stone-faced federal agent standing at my shoulder. "Federal interference under the Emergency Powers Act," I said coldly, my voice cutting through her shocked gasp with the finality of a gavel hitting a bench, and I suggested she start calculating how to pay the $50,000 fine that would be coming her way for compromising an active security perimeter. The look of sheer, unadulterated horror on her face was a masterpiece of shattered ego, but I was already moving on, my eyes fixed on the massive Boeing silhouette as it lined up with the emergency landing strip I had cleared on Highway 14. I could see the sparks flying from the crippled starboard engine, a trailing ribbon of fire and smoke that contrasted sharply with the pristine white paint of the fuselage, and I began barking final approach adjustments into my encrypted headset to the lead pilot. My brother and Jeremy were visible through the glass, their mouths literally hanging open as they realized that the woman they had mocked for her lack of ambition was currently the singular point of contact for the most powerful man on the planet. This wasn't a game of dress-up or a pathetic clerical job. This was the raw, unvarnished power of the United States Military Logistics Command, and I was the one holding the reins while they hid behind their mother's curtains. The ground beneath my boots groaned as the weight of the aircraft descended, the shadow of the wings swallowing the Whitaker house and the neighboring farms in a temporary eclipse that felt like the end of the world. I felt a surge of professional pride that had nothing to do with their approval and everything to do with the fact that my coordinates were perfect and my perimeter was holding. As the massive tires finally shrieked against the asphalt 3 miles away and the motorcade accelerated with a synchronized roar to meet the wounded bird, I knew that the power dynamics of the Whitaker family had been permanently incinerated in the heat of those jet turbines. I didn't need a selfie or a Scottsdale condo to prove my worth. I had the cold, hard reality of a successful mission and the silent respect of the men in black suits who were now fanning out across the property to ensure the commander-in-chief's safety. Family is the group that thinks they know you best. But as the dust began to settle and the sirens faded into a professional hum, it was clear that none of them had ever truly seen me until I stood between them and the falling sky. For exactly 20 minutes, the modest and weathered childhood home I had once been so desperate to escape became the absolute epicenter of the free world, a tactical hub where the survival of the executive branch was being managed from a ruggedized tablet on a grease-stained picnic table. I coordinated every moving part of the high-stakes security transfer with the cold and clinical precision of a master clockmaker, my voice remaining a steady and unwavering anchor in the storm as I processed encrypted data streams and barked orders to the Secret Service counter-assault teams. I purposefully chose to ignore the muffled sound of my mother's sobbing apologies drifting through the kitchen window and the heavy, stunned silence of my father, who was now watching from the porch with the realization that he had spent decades misunderstanding his own daughter. I didn't need a belated thank you or a sentimental validation from the people who had spent the last hour comparing my career to a retail clerk, because my entire existence had narrowed down to the singular, binary objective of ensuring the president's wheels touched the tarmac at Lincoln Regional Airport without a catastrophic hull failure. When the final confirmation chirped through my earpiece with the words "bird is down and secure," the immense atmospheric tension that had gripped the backyard finally broke like a fever, leaving behind a world that looked the same but felt fundamentally altered. The hierarchy of the Whitaker family, built on the superficial metrics of Scottsdale real estate and passive income streams, was forever shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces under the weight of the silver oak leaves on my shoulders. I stood in the middle of the flattened grass, watching as the black Suburbans began their disciplined egress from the driveway, their tires throwing up the same Nebraska dust that Sandra had mocked just an hour before. My sister emerged from the house, her eyes red and her posture slumped, looking at me not as a sibling to be pitied but as a formidable stranger who wielded more power in her pinky finger than Sandra could ever hope to accumulate in a lifetime of luxury flips. The silence between us was no longer the silence of my exclusion, but a profound and reverent quiet born from their realization that while they were playing at success, I was the one holding the shield that protected their very right to be superficial. I didn't look for a hug or a reconciliation because the mission had been the only priority, and as the last helicopter banked away toward the horizon, I felt a deep internal peace that required no audience. Family isn't always the blood that flows through your veins. Sometimes family is simply the people who are lucky enough to be standing in the shadow of a woman who refused to let the world fall apart on her watch. I packed my field tablet into its pelican case with a satisfying click, adjusted my tactical boots, and walked toward my truck without saying a word, leaving the Whitaker legacy behind in the dirt where it belonged. Duty is a debt that never truly settles, but on this humid afternoon in Ashford, I had paid my portion in full, and the silence I left in my wake was the most honest conversation we had ever had. The aftermath of the extraction was a literal and figurative graveyard of reputations, a silent landscape where the carefully curated facades of my relatives lay in ruins among the debris of a half-eaten lunch. My cousin Jeremy's carefully cultivated brand as a self-made entrepreneur was effectively incinerated after the local news crews from Channel 8 Omaha captured high-definition footage of him being escorted off his own porch by 3 men in full tactical vests and pelter headsets, looking more like a confused trespasser than a titan of passive income. The footage of him stumbling over a $40 garage sale chair while a federal agent held his arm went viral within 30 minutes. Stripping away every ounce of the artificial prestige he had spent years building on LinkedIn and Instagram. Sandra fared even worse as her Scottsdale circle of luxury real estate influencers watched in real time through the brief, glitchy snippets of her final failed livestream as she was silenced and dismissed by the very sister she had spent the entire morning mocking as a low-level DMV worker. The irony was a jagged blade that cut through the remainder of the afternoon, leaving her to deal with the digital fallout of her own arrogance while her phone remained in federal custody as evidence of administrative interference. I stayed on the flattened lawn long after the last vibration of the Black Hawk engines had faded into the Nebraska horizon, watching the dust finally settle over the remains of the ruined peach cobbler and the scattered, grease-stained napkins that were blowing against the fence like white flags of surrender. The air was finally still, yet it felt hollow, carrying only the faint scent of ozone and the heavy weight of a silence that could never be filled with idle chatter again. I had saved the operation and ensured the continuity of the executive branch through sheer logistical brilliance and iron discipline, but in the process of revealing my true self, I had finally lost the family I now realized I never really had to begin with. They had never loved Eliza. They had only loved the version of me they could look down upon to feel better about their own shallow lives. And now that the illusion was shattered, there was nothing left but the cold reality of my rank and their resentment. My father stood by the screen door, his hands deep in his pockets as he looked at the deep ruts my Silverado had left in the grass, but he didn't call out to me or offer a hand, as if the silver oak leaf on my shoulder had turned me into a statue of salt. I felt no sorrow as I began to clear the tactical cord from the perimeter, only a profound sense of closure that felt as final as a locked vault at the Pentagon. The Whitaker family reunion was the last time I would ever play the role of the quiet failure because Major Eliza Whitaker had no room in her life for the petty grievances of people who measured worth in Airbnb ratings and silk scarves. I had performed my duty to the nation and to myself, and as I climbed back into the cab of my truck, I didn't look back at the glowing windows of the house because I was already calculating the next set of coordinates for a world that actually understood the cost of security. Family is not defined by the blood you share in a humid backyard in Ashford, but by the trust and respect earned in the trenches of real consequence. And as I pulled away from the curb, I left the ghosts of my past to haunt the wreckage of their own making. I was a soldier of the quiet machine, a sentinel for a world they were too small to inhabit, and the silence I left behind was the only inheritance I truly owed them. Reality had arrived in a roar of jet engines, and when it departed, it took the last of my illusions with it, leaving me alone, efficient, and entirely free. That evening, as the adrenaline finally began to recede and leave behind a cold, crystalline clarity, I sat before my secure laptop and drafted a single, final email to the family group chat that had for years been a repository of my sister's vacation photos and my cousin's obnoxious financial boasting. I did not offer a reconciliation or an explanation for my sudden departure. Instead, the body of the message contained nothing but the hard, undeniable facts of my existence, including my official rank as major, the specific federal statutes governing my top-secret security clearance, and a rigid set of permanent boundaries that signaled the end of my participation in their theater of mediocrity. I informed them that I had accepted a high-priority transfer to a command post at Ramstein Air Base in Germany, effective immediately, and that there would be no more reunions, no more holiday gatherings, and no more opportunities for them to use me as a convenient punching bag for their collective insecurities. I sat in my quiet, minimalist apartment in Omaha, a space defined by sharp lines and functional furniture that mirrored the order of my mind, where the only sound was the low-frequency hum of my own success and the distant, rhythmic ticking of a precision wall clock. The air in the room was cool and smelled of nothing but fresh ozone and expensive espresso, a stark contrast to the stifling humidity and charcoal smoke of the Ashford backyard that I had finally purged from my system. My phone buzzed incessantly on the glass tabletop with desperate notifications from Sandra and my mother, but I did not reach for it, knowing that their sudden interest was not born of love but of a frantic, panicked desire to align themselves with the power they had so recently witnessed. They were no longer my concern. They were citizens of a world I protected but no longer belonged to, and the distance between us was now as vast as the Atlantic Ocean I would soon be crossing. I looked at the silver oak leaf resting on my desk, its polished surface catching the dim light of the evening, and I felt the weight of my calling settle comfortably onto my shoulders like a perfectly tailored dress uniform. The Whitaker family had spent 20 years trying to diminish my light so they wouldn't have to face their own shadows, but the roar of the VC-25A had blown away their illusions and left them standing in the wreckage of their own egos. I realized then that family is not a biological obligation to endure disrespect, but a voluntary association of people who recognize and honor the core of who you truly are. By choosing my duty and my integrity over the suffocating expectations of a house that never saw me, I hadn't just saved a presidency, I had saved myself from a lifetime of being a ghost at my own table. There is a profound, almost sacred peace in knowing exactly where you stand in the world. And as I closed my laptop and prepared for the 0400-hour transport to the airfield, I knew that I was leaving behind the girl they thought they could break. Major Eliza Whitaker was moving forward into a future defined by consequence and competence, leaving the petty grievances of Ashford to wither in the dust of the Nebraska plains. I was the architect of my own life, the guardian of secrets they couldn't fathom, and as I looked out the window at the dark, expansive sky, I understood that true dignity is the only thing that remains when the noise of the world finally goes silent. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, but sometimes, the person who stays is just you, standing tall and unbroken in the quiet center of your own power.